But Lamar Johnson from National Public Media, which is the sponsorship arm of NPR. Do I have that right?
Yes, it's the for-profit sponsorship subsidiary of NPR.
He's bringing to us a really interesting case study, a sort of less is more case study around their Tiny Desk concert initiative and the ways in which they engaged a small group of social influencers to get much greater amplification effect. Lamar is the VP of Sponsorship Marketing at National Public Media. He leads their B2B sponsorship charge. Also a documentary filmmaker.
Yep, a documentary filmmaker. I made a PBS documentary about 7 years ago on the artist Kehinde Wiley.
Whoa.
You may have heard of.
Lamar Johnson.
Thanks, folks. Good to be with you all. So I thought I'd actually be presenting to an audience of one. So for you guys to be in attendance, I think I'll start with a note and a video audience of millions to all these folks out in the universe. So thanks for hanging out. I'll try to keep this to my allotted 15 minutes because I know folks are trying to get out of here. And if you haven't had a chance to make your way to a couple of famed Nashville eateries, I'd strongly suggest, if you have the time, to avail yourself of Central Barbecue. Anybody heard of that by a show of hands? Check it out. It's less than a half a mile away from here. And Prince's Nashville Hot, which I think these guys have had the experience of. So I'd highly encourage you guys to check them out. So as Steve mentioned, I'm the VP of Sponsorship Marketing for NPR. And I've been doing so-called influencer marketing for over 20 years. I'm a little older than perhaps I look, but I've been doing influencer marketing before it was even referred to as influencer marketing and before the prevalence of social media kind of captured the minds and captivated the attention span of young people and some older folks as well. So I have quite a bit of experience in the space. By a show of hands, how many of y'all are familiar with NPR? It's a pretty well-known brand. Cool. How many are familiar with the Tiny Desk franchise? Cool, thank you. For those that may not be familiar, the Tiny Desk franchise is really part of NPR music, obviously, but it has a number of forms of expression within our organization. And so there are the Tiny Desk concerts, which are probably the most famous. Some of the biggest artists in the world have come to our headquarters in DC and performed at literally a tiny desk of one of our employees, Bob Boylan, who created the Tiny Desk franchise. But there's also an expression of the Tiny Desk franchise that is more competitive in nature, the Tiny Desk contest, which is really for up-and-coming artists who are looking to make their big break into the music industry. And then there's also a live, in-person, experiential expression of the Tiny Desk idea, and that's the Tiny Desk Fest, which is actually happening as we speak this month of June in cities across the country. And so, without further ado, I'll just jump right in and talk a little bit about, what it is that NPR is looking to do and what it is that our sponsor, the sponsor of NPR Music and the Tiny Desk franchise, was looking to do with the program and how we were able to engage influencers in that regard. So I'll just start with a little bit about NPR. We're 50 years old. We reach millions, tens of millions of folks every single day. We have member stations and news bureaus across the country and around the world. And for those that are familiar with who we engage with from an audience perspective, we're best known for reaching a highly coveted, highly educated, high household income, evangelistic, discerning audience that's not necessarily the most diverse. It's somewhat homogenous. And so part of our corporate North Star, as we refer to it, is really to drive younger and more diverse audiences and draw them into the NPR franchise, and specifically NPR Music and the Tiny Desk franchise. And so this idea of driving younger, more diverse audiences is really top of mind for us and really is, again, our organizational North Star. It's what we do. It's what we're all focused on, from our CEO all the way down to every salesperson, every journalist, and every person in programming. So that's what we do. Our sponsor for the Tiny Desk franchise for the last few years, this is the third year of their sponsorship, is a pretty well-known insurance company that's a pretty good neighbor of State Farm. You all may have heard of this little insurance company that has a pretty big business and does a lot of advertising, as I'm sure you all have seen. And so as part of our initiative for the Tiny Desk contest, specifically back in 2021, I'm losing track of time, we took the initiative to conduct an experiment. State Farm didn't ask us to engage influencers on their behalf for the Tiny Desk contest. We decided that we wanted to try to take a roll of the dice and do something different that hadn't been done before, with the objective of, again, drawing in and driving younger and more diverse audiences toward the Tiny Desk contest franchise. And so that's what we did. We did this experiment. We, wanted to leverage the scale of influencers, but also the engagement that influencers can provide, and do it in a way that was unexpected. As you can imagine, being a public media organization, the idea of aligning with influencers is a bit of a risky proposition. We're a relatively conservative organization. We have guidelines and guardrails that dictate, ethical involvement with not only our sponsors, but others as well. And so we had to be super sensitive about what we did in the influencer space and exactly how we did it on behalf of this sponsor. And so what we did was, rather than, and I'm not reading from the slide, I'm just sort of talking with you all, so forgive me if you're reading along, but what we did was, we had the choice, and this is something I've done over the years in my past life, going all the way back to the Jurassic age of so-called influencer marketing. You have the option, which I guess is why Steve came up with that headline about tiny versus big. You obviously have the option of selecting influencers that are huge in terms of their fan following and their influence. I'll just use two names. We weren't seriously considering these, any folks like this, but I'll just use two names that I'm sure you all are familiar with. Jay-Z, Beyonce, and others that you can imagine who have tens of millions of followers for their social media and engage with audiences on a multi-million follower scale, like multi-millions. Obviously, in the influencer space, you have the choice of going that route or almost the antithetical route and going with potentially smaller, less well-known, less followed influencers. And so we took the decision to go the latter route. Rather than, rolling the dice with some huge name, we went after folks that had relatively high engagement with their respective fan bases and who kind of had a diversity of focus in terms of what they were putting out in the social media and content creator space. So a couple of examples of those folks are Kev on Stage. Show of hands, anybody ever heard of Kev on Stage? That's actually a good thing. He's a comedian and sort of a social commentator that we identified as someone who had a pretty high engagement rate with his followers, but that was, interesting to us in terms of how he was talking to his audience and engaging with them on a regular basis. And another one is Taylor Pierce. And so, anybody familiar with Taylor Pierce? She's a dancer. So another one with not a huge fan base or huge following, but high engagement with her audience on social media. And so these are just a couple of examples. I'll actually get further into the presentation and show kind of who some of these folks are and what it is that they did for us from the perspective of engaging with the audience. And so we hired these influencers, had them give their sort of assessment of their favorite entries to the Tiny Desk contest program and talk about who their favorites were, why they liked these artists, and encouraged our audience to explore the other contestants within the program and to also make their own recommendations and provide their own thoughts and input into who our audience thought were some of the best participants in the Tiny Desk contest. What else? So here they are. So Taylor Pierce is the young lady on the far left. I think she's got about looks like 2.3 or 2.5 million followers. She actually performed the best for us, which was kind of unexpected. She's a dancer. She kind of does these little funky dances. I'd encourage you to check her out when you have a free moment. You see Kev on stage in the middle. Butterscotch and Janet O'Kay were two of the really tiny influencers that we identified and engaged with. As you can see, their followers, their number of followers are relatively low, but again, they have a pretty high rate of engagement. And then these other two on the right side of that slide are at the top, Brother, who have, I guess, about 1.6 million subscribers on YouTube, and Twins the New Trend. Anybody ever heard of Twins the New Trend? About 2 years ago, if y'all remember, there was these guys kind of got their big break from a media perspective in terms of, these are reaction artists. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the reaction genre on YouTube and on social media, where mostly young people react to classic music that they're just being exposed to. So again, I'm way older than I look. Don't believe the hype, but these two kids at the bottom, Twins the New Trend, got their claim to fame back in 2020 at the height of the pandemic when they reacted to a Phil Collins, I think it was In the Air Tonight music video. They had never heard the song, they had never heard of Phil Collins, and they were just blown away by this song with the drums and all of this sort of dramatic crescendo that song involves. And so we had music reaction folks, we had social commentators, dancers, and everything in between. But none of them were these mega superstars that would be the obvious choice from an influencer procurement perspective. Just a little bit about reach. So, the reach in terms of total views for this program was about 3.1 million, which was really way beyond what we actually expected. And so we really felt like we got a great bang for our buck in terms of what we spend and how we engage with these influencers. We reached over 3 million total accounts. And last but certainly not least, we had over 930,000 total Tiny Desk Contest event views, which exceeded our goal by about 44%. We set a goal at the beginning of 650,000 views and beat that significantly in terms of, again, leveraging the influencers that I mentioned and more beyond what was on the slide. In terms of positive audience engagement, these are just a couple of representative quotes from our audience in terms of, how people were feeling not only about the Tiny Desk Contest last year, but also specifically about, some of the influencers and the messaging that the influencers provided. And Kev on stage, just to use him as another example, or as an example again, really was able to connect with this audience and really start conversations in terms of the commentary and engagement that existed on his platforms. So I won't read these, but you can imagine there are many, many more of these types of quotes associated with the program. So from a qualitative perspective, we felt like it was a home run in terms of our ability to engage with the audience and have sort of a positive vibe and positive perception of not only the artist, but also the NPR music platform and the Tiny Desk Contest program. So some of the entrants, and this is another example of sort of the qualitative impact of what we did with these influencers. Not only did we have our influencers talking about, or our content creators, some folks hate that word influencer, so forgive me if you're one of them. But not only did we have our influencers or creators talking about the program, we also had the entrants, the contestants themselves, sort of engaging with the creators and having a conversation and talking about the posts and expressing appreciation for what the influencers had done and the fact that they were so, pleased to be engaging with these folks. And so, again, from a qualitative perspective, we were very pleased in terms of how this all played out and how it came together, again, using these artists and creators to engage with the entrants as well. So sponsor alignment and amplification. So as I said, the sponsor of NPR Music and the entire Tiny Desk franchise for us is State Farm. This is their third year with us. We're really pleased to have them as the sponsor of NPR Music. And so as part of this initiative, we said, well, how can we integrate State Farm in a way into this influencer or this content creation program? And so, again, by show of hands, I'm sorry if I'm asking you guys to raise your hands too much. How many have heard of Jake from State Farm? Jake from State Farm has taken on several iterations over the years that he's been around. He's changed ethnicity, he's changed his clothes, he's done a bunch of different things, but this is the current expression of Jake from State Farm, and we're super pleased to be aligned with Jake. But what I'll talk about is the fact that, you know, it was challenging, and leveraging influencers in this space and getting State Farm to amplify and align with what we were doing was challenging, because obviously it's a commercial expression of, you know, a more commercial expression of what we were doing with the influencers that we contracted with. But State Farm was game. In terms of recognition in the content from the influencers, there was a caption on every post from our influencers that talked about supported by State Farm. That's a pretty obvious way to integrate a sponsor into the message. But then we also used a little more subtle messaging, like a State Farm mug, in some of the content creations that our influencers executed on our behalf. Some of them gave a verbal shout out on camera as part of their content, and then a logo on the end slate for each placement, if you will. But then taking it back to Jake from State Farm, we actually convinced or worked with State Farm to treat Jake like an influencer unto himself. So in the same way that the influencers that we contracted with talked about State Farm and talked about the entrants and who their favorite artists were that were part of the Tiny Desk contest, Jake did the same thing in a really interesting, engaging way. He talked about who his favorite 3 artist submissions were, just like he was an influencer, just like, you know, anyone else on any of the influencer or social media platforms, and encouraged others to engage, submit their recommendations, or submit their feedback or assessment of who some of the other favorite Tiny Desk contest entrants were. And so, as you can see, there was social media engagement, Jake talking back and forth with some of his fans and followers, and we were just excited that we were able to leverage and integrate a brand property into this effort on behalf of NPR Music. So it was this great combination of our influencers and their ultimate influencer doing their thing to promote the message. Let's see. I think he did his post on YouTube, again, highlighting his favorite contest entrants, and he has a following of just over 100,000 followers, which is great for someone that is basically a commercial personification of the brand. So let's talk a little bit about ROI, and I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I would love to save a couple of minutes for any questions you all may have. I didn't put this in the slide just out of sensitivity for sharing a whole lot of client data, but I'm just going to talk to it just at a cursory level. So as I said at the outset, this was an experiment on our part to see if this could pay off in a meaningful way for our sponsor, and it really did. But as part of the experimental nature of this, we actually we did a paid campaign just to see how a more traditional paid campaign on social media would do in comparison to our influencer campaign. So we spent just about the same amount of money, in the very low 5 figures, and the traditional paid campaign on social media involved us doing these paid posts on YouTube and Instagram, and they did really well. They did just under 1.5 million in terms of views and impressions. But what we were really proud of was the fact that spending roughly the same amount of resources and investment, the influencer results and the performance of these influencers in terms of driving exposure, driving impressions, driving those tune-in views, as I mentioned before, was more than twice the level of what that paid campaign was able to achieve. So from a quantitative perspective, we were super pleased about that fact. From a qualitative perspective, as I talked about, this was all about not only driving those views and driving those eyeballs and driving the exposure to younger, more diverse audiences, but also engaging with them in a way that isn't really possible, obviously, with a paid campaign. So the ability for a conversation to be started, for there to be, more of a back and forth banter, if you will, between influencers and the audience, and for folks to share that content on their own with their friends and followers and so on, again, from a qualitative perspective, was worth all the more to us in terms of the success of this initiative. So we're looking to continue to activate influencers in really powerful ways. It is the way of the future. TikTok is a big priority for us in terms of cracking that nut. And so you all should expect to see more of this from NPR and hopefully NPM and NPR Music. Did I put y'all to sleep?
All right. That was cool. I love using Jake as an influencer. I think I didn't hear it when we first went over this. That part I admit I didn't get. I think that's one of the smartest parts of this. We have any questions? A little more? Yeah.
Hey.
Shannon with the New York Post. How did you guys source the influencers for this? And were you using a social listening tool to understand their engagement?
I'll take the latter part first. So we utilized tracking links and tracking pixels to really figure out who was actually kind of engaging with this and.
How you ID'd them? I mean, how you sourced them?
So it was a combination of folks internal to NPR, folks on the NPR music side, on the NPM side, and then we also used an external boutique influencer agency to help us identify, contract with, work on the videos with the influencers. So it was sort of a three-legged stool that helped us identify and then activate the influencers. And then to my earlier point, we used tracking links and tracking pixels to figure out who was actually tuning in. And to our pleasant surprise, we were pleased to see that 54% of the audience that engaged with this content was in that younger demo of 18 to 34. So we were really pleased about that.
And diversified audience as well, because I mean, you started by saying you wanted to diversify the audience, not just by age, but by ethnicity as well.
From an anecdotal perspective, by ethnicity, I mean, the tracking information that we have that was most readily available was about age. But just in terms of as we looked at some of the engagement that was going on with the influencers and the conversations that were being started, anecdotally, we felt strongly that it drove a culturally diverse audience as well.
Okay, so you did I got to ask you this because you did on stage what I do whenever I make the transition from influencer to creator. You used air quotes. What is the for those of us like you and I have been doing this for a long time, and we suddenly saw this transition in terminology from influencer to creator. Does it make a difference? Apparently, it makes a difference to them.
It makes a difference to them. I think it makes a difference. It made a difference for us internally as an organization. The word influencers is loaded. It has a lot of baggage associated with it, and people think influencers, well, you can't influence me. How are you going to influence? Like, it has such a connotation to it that I actually use the word broadcast towers, or the words broadcast towers. That's my preferred reference to this whole phenomenon of influence. But creators as well is an interesting way of referring to them.
It does seem to suggest that we're at a stage of evolution where this group has become much more self-conscious about what it's doing and how it does it,
and is taking somewhat, a lot of them especially are taking they not only have more professional tools, the entry point is really easy now because of just the nature of the tools, but that their attitude towards themselves is different.
Oh, absolutely. Every single last one of these people, most of whom you never heard of, had a manager. They have lawyers. They're very familiar with contracts that go along with these sorts of things. You'd be surprised. Like, it was like we were dealing with many celebrities unto themselves. So very sophisticated, very aware of what they provide to the sponsorship community, and they have the expectation to be compensated and to be supported and to have an investment made in them.
Yeah, and my point is it actually isn't a semantic difference. This really is a change in the nature of this world. It's more self-conscious, more professional, and their sets of expectations and the way you partner with them and deal with them is different.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Absolutely. And so, again, back to my point about influencers kind of being this word that has so much baggage associated with it and almost a negative connotation, I would imagine most of them would refer to themselves as creators.
Right. Lamar Johnson, this is cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks, you all. Thanks for listening. Safe travels home.
Get this man some Advil.